a lot of people have this image of religion as if it's just obsessed with sin and it's just laden with a morbid kind of guiltiness. I think people see, especially Catholics, in this light. People think that Catholics, for instance, with the practice of confession, the sacrament of confession, that Catholics are just constantly worried about being sinful and constantly obsessed about their own wrongdoing. And I think that this perspective, although it is very widespread, is not only wrong, but it's almost the opposite of the truth. The fact is that secular, atheist, modern people are actually way more plagued by guilt than a lot of people realize. Catholicism in particular, the practice of confession is really a way of not having to worry about guilt. It's a way of dealing with it precisely so that it's not constantly creeping into your life and infecting your everyday experience of life. I would argue that secular, modern, atheistic type of people who think that they're too good for confessing their sins, who think they're too good to worry about guilt as if they can just have done with guilt once and for all, those people are actually the ones who, in the long run, find their life overwhelmed with fears and anxieties of their own shortcomings. And I think I know exactly why this is the case. What happens is if you reject a healthy concern for sin and dealing with one's objective, authentic guilt through a technique such as the confessional, what happens is you then, before you realize it, you're imputing a kind of normative or moral dimension to your everyday pursuits. What a healthy religious person would say are relatively trivial, insignificant earthly matters, such as pursuing your career or pursuing a different set of personal objectives, whatever they might be. Those things actually are not that significant if you have a healthy attitude towards what really matters, which is, living a good life instead of falling into traps of evil. So if you actually, for instance, pay attention to your sin and are willing to carve out a specific contained time and place where you deal with your sinfulness and you actually do feel guilty for what you deserve to feel guilty for, and you deal with it in its proper time and place, then let's say if you don't get a job promotion or you ask someone out on a date and they reject you, these kind of mundane, trivial things, that doesn't matter. You don't feel guilty for those things. You would never think of those things in a kind of moral light. Like if I'm not going to bring it to my confessional, if I'm not going to tell my priest about it as a sin, then in fact, it actually is much more relaxing. I'm not going to be concerned about it. But if you think that you're above sin and guilt altogether, you think that you can just have done with that, then when you fail to get that promotion or someone rejects you when you ask them out on a date, these kind of mundane things actually make you feel bad in a guilty way. Like you feel like there's something wrong with you or you did something bad. So I would say that people who think they're too good for paying attention to their own sin and confessing and having this kind of religious structure to dealing with what they're actually guilty for end up feeling more guilty in a kind of confused and diffuse way for all kinds of stuff that actually a healthy attitude would not even think about on a moral or normative plane. You wouldn't even think about those things in terms of good or evil or right or wrong. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why healthy and intelligent religious people are often capable of longer term, more kind of interesting and idiosyncratic creative work. I think it's really hard to get a creative project off the ground if you have a fear of failure that is essentially mixing in with the moral plane, because in the other parts of your life and mentality, you're not actually giving time and space to the properly and significantly moral or ethical, challenges of life. So in a weird way, I think this kind of low-level, diffuse guilt that atheistic, agnostic people feel prevents them from ever trying anything particularly interesting, let alone following through on it, because if they fail to do it, they experience that as a kind of moral shortcoming, when in fact it's not. If you see creative and intellectual work or personal projects as just the relatively trivial playful, earthly games that they are, then you're much more likely to play jazz and mess around and be creative and see what sticks, because you're not going to feel bad for anything that might not go as you planned. So I actually don't think that religious people, and I certainly don't think that Catholic people, are half as obsessed with guilt or weighed down by guilt as a lot of people think they are. In fact, I think the concern for guilt and dealing with one's sins frankly and forthrightly is actually a way of not having to worry about it in the overwhelming majority of the rest of one's life.